So Whitney, in terms of the like levers of power and how this works, and you might not have a direct answer for this, but in the last 10-15 minutes we've listed like a lot of names, a lot of scandals, a lot of companies. Some appear to be connections, some appear to be close relationships, but like in the end I kind of just want to know how the levers of power here working. Do you like, is there central efforts that come from intelligence agencies that say this is how we are going to control the financial system in the world? And do they just co-opt people into it? Or they're just elite groups, and suddenly if you build a company, you become successful, you get to join that elite group, and because of the nature of man, when you're in that elite group, you start to do shady things. There's shady kind of incentives, and how come everyone ends up a pervert?
Well, I think not exactly sure where to start on that, actually.
I'm basically asking, how much do you think of this is like planned, and how much do you think it's organic?
Well, I think a lot of people perhaps don't necessarily understand how intelligence agencies operate, or like the context in which they exist. There have been efforts in the past to privatize off aspects of the CIA, or the CIA spun off aspects of itself to be off the books, that then continue to operate and like lose control and get involved in all sorts of crazy stuff, and get involved with oligarchs and all sorts of things. Oligarchs, for example, the Rockefeller family, had their own intelligence agency during World War II, before the CIA even existed. Oligarchs continue to do that kind of stuff even to today. Right. So there's all these different factions, even within the CIA. There's factions. Some are in power, some lose power, depending on who's put in a CIA director, for example. It's not a monolith that's just like, oh, this is the CIA and this is what they do. Things develop and things change, but consistently, there's been a direct connection between CIA and, the big, the biggest forces in, American financial markets, since its origins. And so I think within these factions, there absolutely are efforts to control members and sort of keep them bonded and from going to another faction and another side. And I think, if you look at the history of sex blackmail in the United States, that's absolutely true. It's not something that's just recent, that just started with like Epstein, for example. It's something that has a very long history and was really something that was first practiced, arguably, by organized crime in the United States. And then organized crime in intelligence teamed up during World War II. Explicitly, it's documented. You can read my book or look up Operation Underworld, where the OSS and the Office of Naval Intelligence expressly teamed up with the New York mob, specifically the National Crime Syndicate, which was a merger of the Italian mafia and the Jewish mob. And how they ended up, a lot of their members became the assassins for CIA death squads and all sorts of stuff in the 50s and 60s and so on. And so those sort of, it worked for the mafia. The CIA was like, this works for us too. And they weren't the only ones that learned that either. Right. And so when you compromise someone, often what happens is that you can, those compromised people, they determine what sort of vice they have, and then they give them unlimited access to that vice in exchange for their cooperation. And bad things may happen to them, but only if they try and leave that tacit agreement, right? And there's been people that have worked in the CIA that have come out and become whistleblowers. For example, John Kiriakou, who said in interviews and things that, like, when the CIA is trying to cultivate a source and the source wants a child for sex, and the CIA wants that information, they give it. They give the guy what he wants.
Jesus Christ.
Well, it's an admitted thing, and again, this is not just something that happens in the CIA. I think it's a lot more widespread than that. And I think now in this era of big tech, and one of the reasons the same network and group wanted to dominate big tech is because once you can get backdoors into people's devices, you don't really need to set them up with sex blackmail. You can have all their communications and find some sort of dirty laundry on them to get them to cooperate, or find out all sorts of things about them that they would never or try not to reveal to you. And even there's some cases where I'm sure they could put, things on your computer that aren't yours and then have you arrested and whatever. I mean, the whole potential to manipulate tech that way exists. And I think it definitely has happened. And I think the fact that you have a lot of this symbiosis between big tech and intelligence agencies is certainly a very troubling development. And I think ultimately the factions behind this, what they want is more power and control. And they're, if you look through history, they're very ruthless in obtaining those things.
But do you believe the people there in themselves believe they are the good guys trying to make the world a better place? Or do you think it's just a completely broken agency now? It's completely rogue, doesn't know what the fuck it's doing?
It depends on who you're talking to, I'm sure, and what level of the hierarchy they are in. The CIA, like a lot of these other things, are hierarchies, and so the people at the top may know a lot more than the people at the bottom that feel like they're keeping the world safe for democracy or whatever, And then the people at the top are like, this corporation wants us to start a war there and pick off this leader and do this thing. I mean, I'm sure it's very different worlds at the top and the bottom.
You just follow the money.
But I think, when you're aware of the crimes of the CIA, I couldn't ever understand wanting to work there. But, obviously people have different backgrounds and different motivations and different views about these things. And people think all sorts of things about themselves.
But I also, I think that's a good kind of transition though, back to sort of some of this Endeavor stuff, right? Because it's like,
well, can I jump in before
Sure.
we get to Endeavor?
Yeah.
Just because it's linked to this. By the way, I brought up the In-Q-Tel website whilst you were there because I'd never heard of them before you brought it up, and I thought it was quite interesting. So I'm just going to read you what it said. IQT's unique approach to pairing high-tech problem solvers with government challenges has produced countless impactful solutions for the CIA, DIA, FBI, NGA, NRO, NSA, DHS, including CBP, and other DHS components, US Cyber Command, and the UK and Australian national intelligence communities. We've recently welcomed the Office of Naval Research, US Central Command, and US Space Force as new government partners, and look forward to supporting their missions too. So is this basically what you're saying is a public-private partnership?
Public-private partnership.
They're using
absolutely.
the language of being independent. Then quite interesting, if you go on the homepage, it starts with soldiers, and then there's a drone, and then there's a rocket taken off, and then there's a lab. I don't know what they're testing. But it also just looks fucking shady.
Yeah.
but their lead line is investing in global innovation to secure the nation. So could it be that a lot of these people think they're like patriots and their belief is they're doing the best for America?
I'm sure some of them feel that way, but I don't think that's true. I think if you look at the agency's history, that's absolutely not true. They consistently protect the interests of, the most powerful oligarchs of the country. That's who they serve, and that's who our politicians serve. And that's essentially what the power structure in the United States is built around serving. And the oligarchs are accountable. Leslie Wexner will never be held accountable for what he helped fund with Epstein, ever. No interest in going after him at all because he's the real money man, right? Epstein was middle management.
And Max Levchin, who's a PayPal mafia, OG in the PayPal world, came out and did an interview with Charlie Rose where he specifically says, well, PayPal at the beginning, we talked to every 3-letter and 4-letter agency that was around to get more information for when we were building PayPal. And he explicitly said, I look at the NSA and these groups, as being patriots and as being, why would Americans get upset that these people are, yeah, sure, they're reading our messages, but they're protecting our the security of the border and the country and all this stuff post 9/11. And so I think that, there are people that either perpetuate that idea that it's good, or people that just genuinely believe that. But I think that's sort of where, it's an important thing to talk about in this kind of Endeavor model, where they're basically trying to obfuscate all of the connections of this greater system. And I think a lot of people that it would be ridiculous for me to come out here and be like, I think Tether's bad because of this, and then say everybody that works for Tether is a bad person and is evil. It's obviously that's not true. That's just impossible. Of course not. And a lot of the people that work at a lot of these companies, like a Xapo or Endeavor, or, I'm sure there were a ton of companies that are affiliated with Endeavor that are some of the best, most, they have the best intentions possible. Of course, like I'm still a human, and they are too. But there are these, there's a small group of people basically at the top of these kind of organizations that are looking at the private sector of emerging markets. And I think they are directly connected to a lot of incredibly insidious stuff. And they're building this infrastructure that when you zoom out and take a look at it, you can see how this is perpetuating the US Treasury complex. And perpetuating the data broker model of Silicon Valley. And so, yes, you have to kind of stop and be like, okay, well, it can't just all be these nebulous connections that are not related. And people kind of say that about, some of the stuff we've written, and people say that about Whitney's work all the time, that, like, oh, these are just loose connections and blah, blah. It's like, no, like you don't know how many things we left out that we didn't even put in this thing that connect a lot of these things. These are the important connections. These are business connections. These are infrastructure connections at the incubation of these startups. This is direct funding. Max Levchin is on the board of Xapo, or was on the second iteration of the board. Benchmark Capital, which gave the money for Casares. Matt Kohler is on the board. He's a founding member of Facebook and LinkedIn. He worked at Benchmark. They gave eBay their first founding in 97, which then, of course, Omidyar picked up. Benchmark was founded by Bob Cagle, who is a former employee of TVI, Technology Venture Investors, which was the sole seed investor of Microsoft in 81. Microsoft and Bill and Melinda Gates are big, donors of Endeavor. Also Cagle's Benchmark was advised by Burton McMarty, who was also part of TVI. So it's like, these aren't just like loose connections. These are like very serious investments and business partners and board members. That's kind of how this works.
Club, sorry, let me just give like a really poor analogy, but just run with me. Is this just an elite club? Like my comparison, I create a podcast, it suddenly becomes the one that like a lot of people listen to Bitcoin. I suddenly get, like in Nashville, I'm invited to so many Bitcoin dinners because of it.
Right.
And I get asked to be an advisor on a lot of companies, and I get a lot of benefits from it because of it. And I can make connections to people, and there's a lot I can do because of creating this. Is that like a microcosm version of this elite version? Like you create $1 billion company, and then suddenly you get invited on this board because you're in this club and you're that useful connection. And it's like this organic system of elite people that's also infiltrated by 3-letter agencies. And then in that, maybe some people just accidentally end up on this slippery slope to become something they didn't expect. And suddenly they're having to make decisions they didn't expect.
I think that's possible in many instances. When you look at the companies that became the biggest companies in big tech, like the example Mark gave about PayPal, they started off going around and trying to build and make their company and make it a success with those intelligence agencies. For example, Pierre Omidyar of eBay, he was one of the first big tech people to team up with the FBI and the national security state, and had people spying on people's transactions, trying to flag stuff for the federal government. And that only deepened over time. Right. In the case of like Palantir, they explicitly wanted to recreate that failed DARPA program, and they were going around the person helping them. The person that was going to run TIA was a guy that the top official in the Reagan administration that was convicted during Iran-Contra, John Poindexter, who's considered the godfather of modern surveillance. And Thiel and Karp wanted to talk to him, and the person that connected them was Richard Pearl, who was one of the top architects of the Iraq War and serving in the Bush era Pentagon. And another person that came into the mix here was the CIA's top champion of TIA, Alan Wade, who was a business partner of Christine Maxwell's in Gilead, which I mentioned earlier. And they go on to help create the privatized version of that. But that's what Thiel and Karp wanted from the beginning. And Thiel was coming from that, coming at that venture fresh off of selling PayPal to Omidyar, and then building PayPal with the early involvement of these 3-letter agencies. And Palantir, they had engineers going to Langley, Virginia, CIA headquarters every 2 weeks for the first several years of their existence as a company. And the CIA was like their only known client for the first several years of their existence. And a lot of these companies, including like Google, Amazon, are all CIA or military contractors, if not both. And then you have like some of these other PayPal connected oligarchs like Musk, who are also contractors through their various current ventures right now, like with Space Force, for example. And so
it's so depressing.
Well, okay, but it's like, it's business for them, right? They're like, the government is the best client we can have because they can do all sorts of stuff to make it happen and ensure your success. Right. And I would argue that the public-private partnership is the core of crony capitalism.
So you're being corrupted by money.
Which I would argue is really the system of capitalism the United States has had for most of its existence, if we're quite honest about it. And these intelligence agencies work with, the top people in markets, the top hedge funds, giving them early intelligence about what's going to happen. They trade it, they make $1 bazillion, and then they rise to the top of the heap.
And this isn't just like a 90s thing, Peter. Like this isn't just 2000s. Like we look at, D Hawk and kind of this, looking at the organizational structure of Visa at the beginning of this piece, being a Xapo board member. And you look at in September 58, when Bank of America, kind of launched Bank AmeriCard, which was sort of like the first kind of payment card of any size scale. The way that they started and got their first customer base was they just mailed out 65,000 cards out of their Fresno based branch. Literally at that time, who was the manager of the Fresno branch, who ended up becoming an executive VP at Bank of America, Ralph F. Young, who's a 6-year veteran of the U.S. State Department and the CIA. So they're doing this in the 50s. This is just well documented throughout all of this information broker stuff. There's just always this connection between banking, intelligence, and technology.
So think about someone like Larry Fink, who's on record saying markets like totalitarian governments. It's because there's way less risk when the government is totalitarian and authoritarian. And so it's better for someone like Larry Fink because they can make money when there's less risk, right? And they know how to trade stuff and buy what and whatever. And a lot of that is through this symbiosis with the public sector. That is why Larry Fink is like one of the main champions of stakeholder capitalism and all this stuff. It's because it's good business for him, but it's bad for freedom.
Yeah. Well, I heard somebody explain it recently that, this modern socialism isn't that you need to own the means of production. You just need to own the people that own the means of production. And you get the same outcome anyway, because you get to control everything. It's like the modern day version of East Berlin in that you get to know all information and control every scenario. It's just fucking depressing.
This is sort of the analogy we make at the very beginning, that old adage of, it's not, it's not what you own. It's wait, what is it? It's
I've got it here. These days, power isn't derived from what you know or even who you know, but from who you own.
Exactly. Yes. Thank you for reminding me my own writing. Yeah. There's just so much stuff in my head, but that's sort of where we're at. And that's why, you look at these groups that are these incubator entrepreneurial social groups that are capturing these people at the very beginning, whether it's through taboo, coercion, sex blackmail, whatever, drug vices, or just simply economic incentives and coming in at a time and identifying someone and saying, hey, Wincest, you're the perfect person to be the patient zero for Bitcoin of Silicon Valley because you come from Argentina. You have a story of your family losing your money 3 times, due to inflation and government control and bank failure. And you're the perfect person to do this. And you launched an ISP and you're connected to the PayPal board. You're the perfect person to do this.
Well, should we do Endeavor first? Because we still haven't done Endeavor.
Sure.
Following reading your article, I've spoken to a couple of people who live in South America, and they've said to me, everyone knows who Endeavor is.
Yeah,
and they're really well liked and respected. They've invested in a lot of companies. there's a lot of people aren't looking at Endeavor maybe the way you would, especially in South America. So you have obviously a different spin on it.
Well, I mean, there's so much to talk about here. I don't know where we want to start.
Sure. So, Endeavor is sort of, I would see them as an outgrowth of some of these earlier entities that sort of did similar things. So in our last article, Debt from Above, we talked about the Club of Rome because there were connections of the Green Plus program we were looking at there to the Club of Rome. And the Club of Rome really started through this group called ADELA, which is an acronym, and it was backed by like the Rockefeller family and a lot of these titans of industry, mainly in Western Europe and North America. And their focus was to basically develop the corporate and economic landscapes of Latin America. And so essentially what they would do is they would choose, the companies that they wanted to be successful, and they would, just give them an insane amount of capital based on the context of the country they're in. So there's no really like other competitors that can match that level of capital that's being injected into these specifically chosen companies. And so those companies rise to the top of the heap, and then those people become like local oligarchs essentially, but they owe their newfound power and influence to the people that finance them. And so if, let's say, those people that, from the West, the Rockefeller family, for example, want a particular policy implemented in Latin America, or want, a favor, are those people going to say no? I think it's rather unlikely, right? And so the powerful networks, in the West were doing that in Latin America a long time ago. And what's disturbing is that, those same people at ADELA, like the Rockefellers and the people that went on to fund the Club of Rome, have been big promoters, for example, of deindustrializing and depopulating Latin America. By creating instability and creating all sorts of, other issues or policies, having them implemented across the continent. And it was actually a national security memorandum authored by Kissinger that essentially said the same thing and framed it as as a national security threat. So, we have to consider that this kind of stuff, ADELA had lots of positive PR at the time, and in Time magazine, for example, and other outlets talking about how they were doing great things for Latin American businesses. And so when you look at a group like Endeavor, I'm sure it is framed as positive throughout South America. But the problem is that the people that developed Endeavor, including Rottenberg and Kellner, they have ties that are, as we document in the piece, are of concern. And the people that essentially supercharged Endeavor by giving them millions upon millions of dollars to become what they are now are definitely very disturbing figures, mainly Pierre Omidyar of eBay and the Bronfman family, who, have all sorts of ties to, some of it we've already gone over, but there's definitely a lot more to be said about both of them. And if you look at a lot of, philanthropies in general, you will see that a lot of these very controversial oligarchs, are very interested in funding young global leaders. I say that because, of course, the WEF, World Economic Forum Young Global Leader Program, sort of became infamous in the past few years because of, WEF, the outgoing chairman of the WEF, Klaus Schwab, saying on video that, like, the Young Global Leader Program is so great because, we penetrate the cabinets. And, a lot of people pointed to that as being why, during COVID, all these young global leaders were in all these different cabinets throughout the world. And that was why, one of the reasons perhaps why so many countries adopted the same exact stance and policies as it related to COVID-19. And Endeavor is a similar network. A lot of the people involved in creating it, also young WEF, young global leaders. So is Wences Casares. And, these people aren't just in the public sector, they're also in the private sector. And Endeavor focuses expressly on the private sector in emerging markets, which, as we've discussed, earlier, there's a major interest to have Latin America completely dependent on, the United States, and have it be, financially yoked to the United States, and have its, resources are, belong to the United States. I mean, there's people, in power who have essentially said that, maybe a little more indirectly, in the past. I'm pretty sure John Bolton, for example, who was Trump's national security advisor and is a very, very much disliked neocon, has, quotes to that effect about, like, Latin America's ours, basically. And so, there's efforts to sort of make that happen. And I would argue that Endeavor is a way to sort of develop these corporate landscapes in a way similar to Adela, and to make it look decentralized in name only. But they share a lot of the same funding and they share a lot of the same connections. And when those powerful people at the top come to call to those entrepreneurs, they can be influenced. And I would argue again that perhaps the most important point here is that the main Endeavor-backed companies, a lot of them are based around Endeavor Argentina specifically, are becoming the dominant platforms for e-commerce and fintech and crypto use, and also Bitcoin use, obviously, on the continent, especially at a time when this, what I would argue is an engineered economic crisis in places like Argentina, decades in the making, are forcing people onto these platforms, and they're you had someone like Milei elected expressly because he's like, I'm going to dollarize, and maybe he's not now. But stablecoins are a way to sort of get that. And these are, the dominant force here as it relates to, crypto, payment rails. So much of it is based around Mercado Libre, which is like the e-commerce giant of the entire continent, and was, one of the first Endeavor-backed companies in 1999. Now you have Marcos Galperin being a big figure, but his co-founder at Mercado Libre created Kazakh Ventures, which is he made with another Endeavor entrepreneur, and they've gone to fund thousands of startups. And all of these companies, a lot of time, it's just business sense. You're beholden to your funding a lot of the time because you don't want to lose that funding. And so they have influence with you. They have clout. And so there's a lot of different ways to influence private sector policy. And if you're looking to move, from the public to the private side of the public-private partnership, you need to have a lockdown on the private sector the same way you have it on the public sector. If you want to have, the control and power that you're seeking, you can't just ignore one whole half of that partnership, right? And so I think this is a way to create a constellation of companies. And I'm not saying all Endeavor entrepreneurs are bad or like bad people. The point is, the people at the top and the people like on the board, people like Reid Hoffman, for example, are not good, and they can exert influence on Endeavor entrepreneurs very, very easily, and on the people that own the most important critical companies for fintech in Latin America. And while a lot of these same actors, as we discussed earlier, are basically seeking to push Latin America into covert dollarization with the intent of eliminating really their financial sovereignty in a way that could have major implications for the continent. And, if Bitcoin is about like promoting freedom and banking the unbanked, like, is this, I think this is something that should be discussed, frankly.
And you go and you look at the actual founding of Endeavor itself. Kellner and Rottenberg actually met while doing work for Bill Drayton's Ashoka. And Bill Drayton is sort of known for like inventing the term, of this, social entrepreneurship, kind of this third sector, the citizen sector, basically not private, not public, but this in between nonprofit sector that no one was really kind of doing anything there. And, this is this incredibly influential group. I think he has a quote where he says something to the effect of like 50% of Ashoka funded, entrepreneurs or private sector citizen sector entrepreneurs go on to change public policy in their country. Also, this group, Ashoka, Bill Drayton specifically, is sort of known for pioneering like microfinance and these micro loans as a way to sort of service the global South, Africa, and emerging markets. But what does that actually mean? Like, what in practice, where does the money flow in these micro loans? Well, it's to fintech companies, it's to banks, it's to people that make service charges on these like micro payments and these micro loans, and they get to charge really high amounts of yield on these little micro loans. So you're actually like kind of again yoking, sort of emerging markets under this total guise of, hey, we're doing so good here, but actually we're putting these very high yield loans out and a ton of them, and we're charging service fees all over the place, and we're 50% of the people that come through our organization are affecting public policy. I mean, that's wild. And you look at like Kiva, right?
That was exactly where I was going to go. A great example of what Mark and I just brought up is Kiva, which is one of these like microfinance platforms. It framed itself as being direct peer-to-peer lending. It was not. and was outed for that some time ago. But essentially, this is something that received a ton of money, again, from the same people that back Endeavor, like Omidyar. You have Reid Hoffman on the board, who's also on the board of Endeavor. You formerly had Wences Casares on the board, who's also very affiliated with Endeavor, and I think also used to be a board member of Endeavor, if I remember correctly.
Yep. And PayPal.
And PayPal. And so like Kiva is something that, framed itself as banking the unbanked and banking the unbankable, things like that for a long time. But as time has gone on, what has Kiva done? Well, yes, in certain communities, they were very helpful. But people became somewhat like, in certain sectors and in certain countries and areas of the world, began to use Kiva very heavily. And then Kiva comes around and launches the Kiva protocol and all of this, and now has partnered with the UN to impose digital ID on countries where they were banking the unbanked. And there's a lot of controversy about digital ID because the plans for it are to tie it directly with the CBDC programmable surveillable money system, right? And also have it be the gateway to where you can and can't go, what you can and can't buy, what you can and can't do, your healthcare services, your telecommunications, your social media accounts. These are the plans on the books at groups by the UN and the World Economic Forum and all of these for digital ID. And now Kiva is the one imposing on it. So are they really interested in helping the unbanked, or are they helping, targeting vulnerable communities, getting them dependent on their infrastructure and their products, and then using that to impose the sustainable development goals on them? And if anyone wants to know more about the sustainable development goals, on my website, Unlimited Hangout, I have a running series with Ian Davis where we talk, it's called Sustainable Slavery. And we talk about how the sustainable development goals was essentially created by some of the most predatory bankers in the world, people like Mark Carney, for example, who, and they explicitly say that like one of the main ways to finance the sustainable development goals should be debt, and that we should bury the emerging world in debt. And so that when they come to pay back the debt, just like sort of like the IMF system is, oh, we can't pay back our debt. Well, you're going to have to make all these policy adjustments and implement all these new policies and do all these new things and sell this to that company and do the. It's not.
Is
good.
that the structural adjustment stuff that Alex Gladstein talks about?
Absolutely. Yep.
It is, isn't it?
Yep.
It's the same system, but framed as inclusive and sustainable. And they've literally at the UN created the concept of sustainable debt levels. What is sustainable debt? I mean, it's just completely insane. So this is
Loan sharks.
Yeah. So yes. So it's just a completely it's not what they're selling it as. Does that mean that every company that uses that term, we're banking the unbanked, is like that? No. But this particular network that I'm talking about, that's eBay and PayPal, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Okay. Fuck. This is so depressing. Okay. Let's talk
We'll
about
white
Xapo.
pill you later. Don't worry.
Yeah, don't worry.
No, but look, I've got a question for that coming up. But let's talk about Xapo, and just a bit of context here. Firstly, I was, when Danny told me about this article, he gave me a call and he said Xapo a big part of this. So that was like, okay. I thought Xapo one of the good guys. Like, I love Wences. Wences is a great guy. I've met him. But he's also a bit of a legend in Bitcoin. Like you say, he was orange pilling a lot of people. I mean, I fundamentally believe I still believe he's a good person. I still believe his intentions are very good. And so I'm interested to talk about that. Just a second thing for context. In about 18 days, I'm meant to have a sponsorship contract with a Xapo kick in, which possibly they might cancel once it goes out, or possibly I might not want to do it, or possibly we might agree between us, yeah, this isn't for each other. And that was a real challenge because Danny was like, haven't we got a sponsor coming up? I was like, yeah, it's like a 6-figure deal. I was like, okay, we might not have that anymore. But anyway, it is what it is. I don't know yet if it's something they're going to cancel or I'm going to cancel. We're both going to cancel, but it's a signed contract.
For sure. Well, hey, anyway, I appreciate you being very brave and putting this type of content out. Not everybody does that. It's a very difficult thing to do.
Some people definitely don't do that.
Yeah, and
because you're not the only one getting Xapo deals in the space. So.
Yeah, it's
yeah, but hold on. Am I going to get sued again? I'm literally just tying up the loose ends of my 6-year lawsuit with Craig Wright for libel. Am I fucked again?
I hope not. I hope not. But I think in terms of your Wences being this legendary figure, I mean, he certainly is in the Bitcoin space. I mean, there's literally a post on Mersha's site where Wincest, uses a PGP signature from a web wallet that he has that has since transmitted almost 1 million Bitcoin have gone through one wallet that's affiliated directly with Wincest's name. He basically founded Xapo as a means to, at least the custodial service of it, this very infamous vault, the infamous, Swiss bunker vault, because, he basically orange pilled all of Silicon Valley, got all these people on there, Reid Hoffman, Peter Thiel, all of these, oligarchs of the fintech system coming out of Silicon Valley. He orange pilled them very, very early on. And he built Xapo's custody solution to be able to hold people's Bitcoin because, it's all about security. Having a system like this, whether it's just Bitcoin or a Bitcoin dollar system or what have you, it requires, an unbelievable amount of due diligence for holding your keys. We've seen them compromised all the time when you put them online or do these things. There's countless examples of this happening. So he specifically built Xapo just because his buddies, all of these guys, wanted to buy a whole bunch of Bitcoin, and they wanted to not have to be responsible for holding, $100 million worth of Bitcoin or what have you. Certainly after,
That's
these
fair.
thousands of percents of appreciation, now they have a lot of Bitcoin. They want to be able to figure out, okay, well, how can I kind of offshore this responsibility to someone that I really trust? And they can create a system that it keeps, this Bitcoin really safe. And he did a whole bunch of really kind of creative things to give him credit for building this custodial situation, including using Swiss bunkers, breaking apart, keys and putting them in different servers and different physical locations across the globe. He even partnered with Satellogic, this Endeavor company with intelligence links that we've talked about putting keys in space. He even developed fingerprint scanners, biometric scanners that have pulse readers on them. So if your hand is cut off and not connected to a living body, the fingerprint scanner won't work. So you can't compromise and just chop off someone's hand with an axe and steal all their Bitcoin. Things like that are actually required in building a system like this. If you want to have a Bitcoin system, you need to have a custodial solution that's absolutely fucking bonkers. He built that, and I should say bunkers, and he built that for these people. And so then what did he do? Well, in 2019, he sold it to Coinbase. And he sold it to Coinbase, as he mentions, because capital requirements were getting very expensive. It wasn't exactly the primary reason why he got into this Bitcoin business in the first place. It just sort of developed out of a natural need to hold his friend's Bitcoin. And also he wanted it to go to Coinbase, as he says, because they were the only company really able to give the regulatory environment, adherence, that he was comfortable with. So he didn't want his funds, his customers' funds to go anywhere else. In August 19, I think it was August 2019, they sold to Coinbase custody. Now,
A $50 million deal, right?
Yeah, it was $55 million. But at the time, it meant that Coinbase then became, the largest crypto custodian in the world.
Sorry, just on that, do we know if Coinbase have kept these bunkers going?
So Xapo actually held on to the bunkers themselves. They actually held on to some Bitcoin. I believe that they gave, they said that they gave 514,000 Bitcoin to Coinbase, and then they kept 346,000, worth around 3.5 billion at the time of sale. I'm not exactly sure where that is now or if those clients have moved since. But of course, now 8 out of 11 of the spot Bitcoin ETFs are custodied by Coinbase. So he sold basically this custodial service to Coinbase, bringing it back within the regulatory arm of the United States, being that, Xapo was a Gibraltar, regulated company. So now he brings it back into the regulatory arm of the United States.
So essentially they sold Coinbase a customer base?
Yeah, they sold their clients, like all of these Silicon Valley guys that we've mentioned throughout the piece. Grayscale. So when Barry Silbert's Grayscale, when they transferred to Coinbase custody, it was 225,000 Bitcoin, $2.7 billion in assets. It was the largest transaction in history, in crypto history.
But why would Coinbase want to buy a customer base?
Well, I think personally, I would say within the framework of the Bitcoin dollar system, if you want to onboard and bring all of these Bitcoin back into the United States, back into the regulatory requirements, the capital requirements, where you need to hold X amount of dollars for the liabilities on your balance sheet, which Bitcoin is, Winsett specifically said at the time of sale that there were higher bidders. There were other people that wanted to give Xapo more money for the custodial service. And he said, no, Coinbase is the only one that I feel comfy with. Of course, Coinbase has a lot of connections with some of the early founders, Blockchain Capital, and a lot of these people that, are connected with Xapo. Frankly, I would say that it was probably a deliberate way to onshore the Bitcoin back into the United States. And then, of course, in January of this year, we saw the spot ETFs launch, and Coinbase custody holds 90% of the keys there. So, we got 832,000 plus Bitcoin now in the United States directly affiliated, or almost all affiliated. Fidelity does their own holdings, their own custodial solution. That's like 160,000 Bitcoin there. I'm not sure what the numbers are today, but basically that. So we got 700,000 plus Bitcoin specifically is just at Coinbase, just from, the ETFs here. We're seeing a huge onshoring of Bitcoin back into the United States, which is obviously an essential part of the Bitcoin dollar system. So Xapo sells that off in 2019. And then what did they do? They start integrating stablecoin rails to, basically circumnavigate SWIFT, which is kind of the previous way to kind of move dollars around in interbank. In an interbanking way. So in November 2022, Xapo integrated Circle's USDC. And then in June 2023, Xapo became the first fully licensed private bank on the planet to integrate Tether as a way to, again, circumnavigate these SWIFT rails. So Xapo then, once they build the custody solution for, 6 years or so, 4 to 6 years, and then they sell it off to Coinbase, and then they begin working on being, as they claim on their website, the bridge between US dollars, stable coins, and Bitcoin. And then they build out basically this infrastructure with, again, we've talked about Tether quite a bit here, but Circle also, has a lot of connections with BlackRock, with Visa, other people kind of affiliated in this story. So you're kind of seeing them, once we take care of custody, we take care of, biometric stuff. If you don't have a pulse, the finger doesn't work. We're going into space. We're going down into the ground. All these things that Xapo built from a custodial standpoint, infamously, sells it to Coinbase, and then immediately begins building out the stablecoin rails, which I think is very interesting personally.
Okay. What is the nefarious aspect of Xapo that you're mostly concerned about?
Well, I think one very troubling indicator about Xapo is the initial advisory board they chose to have, and that's why we gave it special attention in this piece. And I would argue the most alarming of the three is Larry Summers. Why would you want to have him near anything is beyond me, but I'll throw it to Mark because he did most of the research and writing on the advisory board. And I'm happy to add more about Summers and some of these other actors.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I would say, well, again, sort of the nefarious thing, unfortunately, maybe you can chalk this up to just unfortunate connections, but, they're holding the elite's Bitcoin. They're holding all of these intelligence-connected private sector people that were involved, that were orange-pilled, if you will, by Winsett early on. These PayPal mafia-connected people. Thiel's come out and said, I really messed up not buying enough Bitcoin. Reid Hoffman, all of these guys that are, intelligence and Epstein-linked. He literally orange-pilled them and held their Bitcoin, and helped facilitate that, and then sold it off, and the client base to Coinbase back within, Coinbase again is, DOJ partnered. So Xapo sort of, from the get-go was, their custodial situation anyway, was built to, as we say in the title of the piece, to hold the elite's Bitcoin. And they held plenty of Bitcoin for these people. There's some percentages being thrown out as from 5 to 8% of the liquidity of Bitcoin being held by Xapo at certain times. Again, that web wallet linked to Winces's name had just under 1 million Bitcoin go through a single wallet. I mean, just absolutely astronomical amount of Bitcoin. So there's some concerns there from a centralization standpoint of ownership, and from that, these are the people that, we look at Bitcoin as being this freedom tool, but here's all these people building quite literally the surveillance state for the state. And they're choosing to work with Xapo. Obviously, that means they must be very trusted, and affiliated to do such, to store billions of dollars at Xapo. But yes, I would say that initial advisory board is very interesting. So we have D Hawk, who's kind of known, I mentioned a little bit, as being the founder of Visa. Later on, he was so into this idea of decentralized organizations that he actually stepped down from Visa pretty early on to basically prove that Visa would survive entirely on its own without his leadership. And then he went on to start doing these lecture series in the 90s that started at the Santa Fe Institute on chaotic organization structures. And he did this talk at the Santa Fe Institute, and he was approached by a member of the Joyce Foundation to get some money to basically come out of retirement and go around influencing people basically on these chaotic organizational structures. And he ended up taking money from the Joyce Foundation to do that because of this talk he did at the Santa Fe Institute. Of course, the Santa Fe Institute is, Epstein on his website lists himself as actively involved in the Santa Fe Institute. Pierre Omidyar is one of their largest founders and is a trustee on the board, just for an example. I'm sure
the co-founder of the Santa Fe Institute was very involved with Epstein, and then also the person that created Edge, the publisher, John Brockman, who helped connect Epstein to a lot of the scientists he funded. But this particular, the guy that co-founded the Santa Fe Institute, thanks Epstein in his 95 book.
Yeah.
He helped get his book published. It wasn't going to get published. Brockman published it because Epstein was the middleman there. And there's a lot of other, connections of note to that particular co-founder.
Gelman is his name. Yeah.
Murray Gelman.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's sort of D-Hawk. We'll run over that really quickly. And I already mentioned
the
sort
Obama
of
thing, though. You don't want to.
Yes. Obama was also at the time of the Joyce Foundation giving this grant to D-Hawk. He was a board member of the Joyce Foundation. Just throwing that out there. We mentioned sort of the Bank America card.
Was that in the article?
No,
What's that?
No, we didn't add it.
No, that's not it. That's what I'm saying.
That one in.
That's what I'm saying. There's all of these things that we don't even mention.
We talked about the piece of the Henry Crown Fellowship and the Crown family a good bit in the beginning, and the Crowns are from Chicago and are along with the Pritzkers, whose rise, same with the Crowns, totally due to organized crime, the reason they're billionaires. And the Pritzkers were very involved in the Epstein scandal, and Tom Pritzker is one of the circled names in Epstein's Black Book. And those are the people that launched Obama in Chicago politics and Illinois politics. That's why a Pritzker is governor of Illinois right now. I mean, they run Chicago, those two families, essentially. And
you look at the Obama administration, its cabinet is sort of infamous for having all of these city connections, and city being a very prominent, kingmakers in his administration.
The Podesta emails, right? There was a guy, a top executive at Citi, basically chose Obama's whole cabinet. Yeah. Right after the 2008, financial crisis.
Yeah. So one of the most prominent people for Citi kind of becoming the absolute behemoth that it is John Reed, who was also on the Xapo initial advisory board. John Reed took over, I believe, in '84 of Citi, before it merged with Travelers and Sandy Weil, who Whitney will get into a little bit, I'm sure, before it merged. And he was really infamous kind of early on for being sort of he's like, why hasn't technology taken over banking? What is up with this? It's ridiculous. Banking is just bits and bytes, and it's a ledger. And, why hasn't this technical revolution really happened in information banking?
A big promoter of financial surveillance as well, John Reed. He's like, if I were the intelligence agencies, I would just go straight to the financial transactions.
Yeah. It literally says that. He's like, yeah, sure, intelligence knows this, but JP Morgan knows when you're going for a divorce because your partner is blowing out your credit cards. And like, they know stuff about you.
They know it before you do.
Yeah. And if I was going to get into information brokering, I would get into a digital bank like PayPal. He literally has a quote where he says that. And also Citi just kind of traded members, with the CIA during the late 90s. John M. Deutsch was a former director of the CIA, resigned in December 96, and then was immediately elected to the Citibank board. While Nora Slatkin, who is a former executive director for the CIA, resigned in 97 and joined in September 97, and then joined Citibank as a VP in October of 97.
And a year later, you have Robert Rubin join Citi after he was Treasury Secretary and helped engineer the dissolving of Glass-Steagall so Citi could merge with Travelers Group, right? Yeah. And then he's rewarded by being on Citi's board. And then his deputy, Larry Summers, takes over, who is also on the Xapo initial advisory board.
Yes.
So why, I mean, you have to ask questions why someone like Wences Casares would want to have these people advise him on Xapo, right?
Yeah.
And this is
but is there a potential, like, let me just try and look at the good side of Wences. He wants to promote Bitcoin. He wants to bring financial freedom to the world. He's doing his best to raise money. He starts to build a company, gets access to money. These people are like, oh, you should have this guy on your board. He's worked here. He's been there. He's like, Wences isn't an investigative journalist like yourself, Whitney, and like yourself now, Mark.
Yeah.
And so he just gets recommended these. I can see a scenario whereby I start a financial company. It's doing well, and I get invited to go to see some, I don't know, and Andreessen Horowitz in America, and they want to invest in me, and they say, yeah, fine, you could have these people on your board. And I'm like, cool, I'll have them on my board, and I go in and try and build my company. And I'm passively accepting these people on my board without really knowing any of their background, just because I'm not a journalist.
Yeah, I mean, it's possible that other people connected Wences to that, and maybe Wences had the mentality that, well, yeah, bringing in all these people from like Wall Street and whatever, maybe that's good for Bitcoin and like mainstream adoption. And there's people making that same argument now. Mark and I disagree about that. I mean, we don't think everything's good for Bitcoin.
Hell no.
Right. But some people see it as maybe he was like, this is a way to get mainstream adoption. I'm happy to play devil's advocate there and entertain that. But there is no excuse for someone like Larry Summers and what they have done.
Yeah.
So maybe Wences didn't know. Maybe he didn't do his homework. You know what I mean? But having these guys on your board, if it wasn't Wences' idea, whoever told him that was, perhaps leading him astray. I don't know.
Yeah. And just to finish one more thing on Reed, though, I just want to say that, for these direct connections, again, we look at Citi, trading board members basically with the CIA or whatnot. But literally in 86, or right after he takes over, he got an invitation. It's on CIA.gov. It's on their reading room. He got a letter from the CIA inviting him to New York to have a conversation with other CEOs to address the Latin American debt problem. And so here we are. Now he's on the Xapo board after being approached by the CIA, 30 years before, 20 years before, 30 years before.
Expressly about
the Latin America debt problem from the CIA. I just don't think these things are sort of accidents. And then we kind of bring in, so we very quickly went over D-Hawk, very quickly went over John Reed. Larry Summers, very interestingly, is, kind of known as sort of like one of the founding forces for the deregulation of the derivative market, and specifically this Glass-Steagall repeal, which was this law passed by FDR during the New Deal in 33 that basically prevented banks from crossing over state lines and from basically commingling mortgage banks with speculative investment banks and insurance brokers. And it said, you can't do this all under one roof. We're seeing way too much stuff happen here, with the original JP Morgan and these groups. We don't want this to happen. So we're putting in this law that basically says you can't do that. Greenspan, before he was, running shit at the Fed, comes out and says, does a pamphlet while he's working with JP Morgan called Rethinking Glass-Steagall. And it's like, hey, we got to repeal this thing. Larry Summers calls it archaic regulation. He says, hey, we got to trust these groups. They're trusted companies. They're obviously doing their due diligence of what speculative, plays that they get into. We have to sort of trust them to do this. They repeal Glass-Steagall. Rubin leaves. He's at Citi now. Larry Summers is there, and Citibank merges with Sandy Wells Travelers. And I'll let Whitney take over and talk about Sandy and that group.
Sandy Wells, the mentor.
Can I ask one quick question?
Mm-hmm. Sure.
What is the Revolving Door Project?
The Revolving Door Project.
Yeah. Okay, so the reason I'm asking, I'm doing the job of Danny because Danny's in bed in Australia, so I'm actually doing some research while you're here. And when I search Larry Summers, this Revolving Door Project keeps coming up. I thought you might know what it is, but
isn't it
now I'm reading.
Isn't it just like an information website where they disclose a lot of the revolving door issues in American politics? Yeah, I think we cite it as a source.
Was created in order to scrutinize. So it says it was created in order to scrutinize executive branch appointees to ensure that they use their office to serve the broad public interest rather than entrench corporate power.
Larry Summers' entry there is very long.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think we cited it as, it's like, oh, wow, he's advising for Citi. He's advising for Andreessen Horowitz. He's on the board of Block. I mean, he's just OpenAI. I mean, he's just everywhere. He's the president of Harvard.
So the article is, we asked the media's most prominent economist about his many corporate entanglements. His defense, stop asking questions. But the interesting thing is, everything you're saying sounds like revolving doors.
Yes.
Of what's going on.
Yeah.
Yeah, but like I said earlier, it's a public-private partnership. You move from public to private when it's convenient for you in this particular network. And that's why the revolving door exists. And they get insanely rich doing it. I mean... Yes.
Yeah.
And so Larry Summers is a great example of that. And also, by the way, as soon as he became Treasury Secretary in 98, he starts flying on Epstein's plane and hanging out with Epstein. Mm-hmm. And when they're at Harvard, Larry Summers supercharges Epstein's access to Harvard and helps facilitate all of that. Very close connections with those two guys. And it's worth pointing out also that it's even bigger than that. A lot of it has to do with Harvard, where Summers was involved at Harvard well before he was in the Clinton administration. He was also at the World Bank. And a lot of these Harvard economist type guys have had very interesting ideas as it relates to Latin American debt. And, obviously Summers was at the World Bank while a lot of this Latin American debt stuff was going on with JP Morgan and Citi and all of that. And Larry Summers, of course, comes back after the financial crisis that he and Rubin helped create to advise the Obama administration on what to do to respond to the crisis. And gee, wasn't it a great response, guys?
Yeah.
We totally reined in Wall Street and their criminality, didn't we? So, Larry Summers is one of the worst examples, worse in the sense of he's horrible, a great example of how the revolving door works. And he's definitely not the only one. Obviously, Robert Rubin, who was above him, is a great example. But, there's a lot to be said about, that type of activity and the consequences it's had. And you could argue that a lot of things that happened in 2008, I don't even really think there was a proper investigation into what caused that crisis, and people that were clearly criminal in causing that crisis were not prosecuted or even investigated by the federal government. And again, Citi helped choose Obama's cabinet, and including his attorney general that would have been responsible for choosing whether or not to prosecute stuff, Eric Holder. So, and the consequences are very significant because it basically shows that they can get away with that type of financial criminality and stealing that amount of wealth from regular Americans and have literally nothing happen to them.
They can.
And Larry Summers is an architect of that. And he's, continued to preside over be involved with questionable companies. As you noted in that Revolving Door Project entry, it discusses, several examples of that. So, someone like Larry Summers is a good, example of, how this system, ends up working, and it's very unsettling. And I guess, unless you want to talk any more about that, I'll jump into what Mark sort of handed over to me, which is talking about Travelers Group briefly.
Well, I just wanted to say specifically with the false dichotomy here, sort of the, the purple party, the red blue thing, is that, in the crisis of 08, it perfectly split the bailout was basically done right over the two administrations. So, the Democrats blame Bush and the Republicans blame Obama. And then that exact same thing happened in 2020 where, basically, the Democrats blame Trump and the Republicans blame Biden for the economy. And there's really no accountability at all whatsoever because these giant stimulus and these crises kind of happen, right at election year, very interestingly, as now we're gearing up for election year and everyone's forgetting again that everything is false dichotomy and it's bullshit. And, here we are fighting again over who we want to rob us this time.
Yeah.
Anyways,
it's a two-party paradigm. It's not actually true in practice. And both parties are extremely corrupt and essentially controlled by oligarchs that have similar ideologies, and a lot of those, and a lot of the same Wall Street entities and what have you. And, a lot of my research too, specifically on someone like Jamie Dimon, shows that he's very tied up with those same oligarchs, specifically people like Leslie Wexner and the Crown family. So in talking about Sandy Weil, who, built up Travelers Group, and then that later merged with Citi to create Citigroup, right? Sandy Weil used to be at American Express for a long time. Jamie Dimon was the guy under him. And then Sandy Weil leaves, Dimon follows him, and they take over this company called, I think it's called Commercial Credit Corp or something, which was a spin-off of this other company that was tied up with all this espionage and tech theft. And Robert Maxwell's Control Data Corp, is the parent company. And so they took their financial arm of Control Data Corporation and used that to build Travelers Group, which was very interesting. Anyway, so in building it up,
Wait, Whitney, are there any good people?
Are there any good people?
Well,
yeah,
cool.
I mean, sure, absolutely.
Good
but the good people, I would argue, are regular people, and the people that manage to climb to the top, especially of industries like Wall Street. To get to the top of Wall Street, do you know how many skulls you have to step on? It's hard to be a good person when you're crushing that much bone under your boot, So. Yeah, but anyway, Jamie Dimon had a falling out with Sandy Weil not that long after the merger with Citigroup and ended up leaving. John Reed was also booted out as well in that, power struggle. And so he was without a job for a year. And this particular bank called Bank One, which is originally from Ohio and intimately connected to Leslie Wexner, starts searching for a new head for the bank. And Bank One had merged with another bank in Chicago in the mid-90s that was dominated by the Crown family, who I mentioned earlier being out of Chicago. And the Crown family, the board members, were dominated by people tied with the Crown family or tied up with Wexner, including John Kessler, who's really just as a right-hand man for Wexner as Epstein was. And actually, they were intimately involved in several ventures together. Kessler, Epstein, and Wexner are the people that picked Dimon and put him in charge of Bank One. And then Bank One merges with JP Morgan. And that's why Jamie Dimon is in charge of JP Morgan. He owes it all to the Wexner circuit and the Crown family, who were both provably linked to organized crime. So
why is Jamie Dimon against Bitcoin?
Well, we'll see.
Does he not understand the big plan here?
It's just rhetoric. I mean, it's same way Trump was against Bitcoin when he's, bringing in Brian Brooks, who's the ex-VP of Coinbase, who is the, as the OCC, who basically makes it so that banks can hold crypto. Bitcoin appreciated greatly under him. He was the best Bitcoin president we've had, honestly. Obviously he's a total ghoul and, locked down the country. And this idea that he is a anti-establishment candidate is ridiculous. But so Trump, tweets out, hey, I'm against Bitcoin. But whereas what is his actual actions doing? I'm putting in the ex-VP who's connected with Mnuchin at Bank West and has some other connections there, advises for Valor. But anyway, so I think a similar thing, JP Morgan, has done a lot of work with the blockchain settlement. They have the Onyx program. They've done some stuff with BlackRock. So their actual actions are very Bitcoin forward or blockchain forward, whereas their rhetoric is, oh, it's a scam, it's this, it's blah blah blah. But
I would argue that the reason Jamie Dimon doesn't like, or publicly says he doesn't like Bitcoin, is because he is so into the idea of programmable, surveillable money. in a way. I mean, maybe he wants to, will, change his tune on Bitcoin as it relates to it being like for asset storage, now that people like Larry Fink have come out and embraced it. But remember, Larry Fink too was against Bitcoin a few years ago. And then obviously has adopted a very different tone since then. And I think that's going to be true of really all of these Wall Street figures that in past years have been very negative about Bitcoin. But JP Morgan, has done a lot on like deposit tokens or tokenized deposits, they're sometimes called. And is likely to, they've made like JP Morgan coin. It's done like an insane amount of money in terms of like the total amount of transactions it's overseen and just like, or been involved in just like a few years and things like that. And we'll see, but he's definitely not adverse to a lot of these movements that are happening in fintech and in the interests of, some of these either governments or intelligence agencies and what have you, or the UN or any of these other groups, and seeing, most of the world, if not all the world, adopt some form of programmable, surveillable currency, which is essentially what the CBDC is, and why CBDCs have been so criticized is because they're programmable and surveillable, not necessarily because it's issued by a central bank, because, fiat is issued by a central bank. Like that, as I understand it, isn't so much the issue around CBDCs. It says they're programmable and surveillable. Okay, so maybe the government isn't doing the programming and the surveilling, but is JP Morgan doing it and then passing off all that information to the government that team up with all the time anyway? Is it really any that better in practice? I don't think so. And then again, as we mentioned earlier, people like John Reed that helped build up this industry have been like, financial surveillance like is the best. Like these are people that are all in to surveil you and collaborate with the people that helped get them in the positions of power they are now. And help, facilitate that type of end game that we're all rapidly being hurtled towards,
And, Citi specifically built out, the 24/7 banking. Like Citi's whole thing was Citi never sleeps. They put in the first ATMs that you could access. They made the financial sector a 24/7 industry, which it wasn't before, outside of cash transactions or things like that. What is Bitcoin? Bitcoin does not shut down. It doesn't sleep. There is no stock market weekends or whatever for Bitcoin. These guys really built up and understood banking is bits. It's we need to basically build infrastructural, computer networks for settlement because, we're having settlement issues. That's what D-Hawk was really, when he came in and started working there at Bank Americard, he was saying like the settlement room was in disarray. It was disintegrating was the phrase that he used. So they're setting up, settlement networks, 24/7 banking. And then we got Larry Summers in there deregulating the derivatives market and repealing Glass-Steagall and letting these huge big banks, too big to fail banks, start playing with our mortgages. That's literally what Glass-Steagall in effect did, which then led to 2008, which then led to billions of dollars printed, which led to a lot of inflation, which led to Bitcoin appreciation. So there's a lot of ways you could literally just look at this advisory board specifically pushing us into the environment that we're in now from a technological standpoint, an infrastructure standpoint, a 24/7 financial standpoint, a settlement standpoint, a deregulation standpoint. They're all there at the beginning on Xapo's advisory board.
Okay, right. Let me ask you something. So you'll know this. When this goes out, there's going to be a lot of people going to be like, yes, love this, amazing. Whitney's amazing. Mark's amazing. Your research is amazing. It's incredible. And obviously there's going to be a group of people who go, no, the tinfoil hat, these people are crazy. They're connecting dots that don't exist and they're making a narrative. I'm not asking you to defend that. My question is can you easily pinpoint what it is and what it is you're suspicious of?
Yeah.
Like, what are you certain of?
I think in the piece we do a very good job of that. The things we don't know, we say. And practically every sentence in the piece has a hyperlink as a source to show you where we're getting it from. And something I've consistently told people in my work and also with my book, but it's not hyperlinks there, it's obviously footnoted, is that you need to check the sources and do your due diligence in the sense of don't take me at my word. Look at this material that we looked at for yourself and reach your own conclusions. You don't need to take our word for it. These are our conclusions. Maybe you disagree with our analysis. Well, then engage with the source material and form your own opinions. And don't just be like, I don't like the way these guys sound. I don't like them talking shit about my favorite dude. and I'm going to turn this off and screw them, conspiracy theorists, which of course is a term weaponized by the CIA anyway to keep people from asking questions about the JFK assassination. But aside from that,
Whitney, you're the best. I adore you.
well, it's true.
Yeah.
I mean, it's literally like a documented thing. Again, people need to be active participants in their media. And I think a lot of the problems we are in now, of course, alternative media has essentially supplanted in terms of viewership and readership mainstream media. But people are still very content to just sit back and just listen to people and not engage with the materials themselves. And, it's a very similar relationship that people have historically had with mainstream media. But we have the internet at our disposal. That's how alternative media has essentially grown to exist. And it should really be important for readers to engage and learn about this information, because it's very important in terms of where the world is going and the decisions and stances we need to take and the tools we need to build in order to prevent the future where these networks tied to organized crime and intelligence, which honestly at this point, as I note in my book, they fused in the 40s. They've functionally been the same thing this entire time. Do we want those people to have unlimited control and power over our finances and over our lives and be able to surveil and track and predict our every move? The answer for me is obviously no. And so the more you engage with the information, the more you can also educate people. You don't just have to, direct people to an interview like this. I mean, it's helpful to have a knowledge base to work off of. And you can be like, no, I've seen the source material. You don't like her, you think her voice sounds nasally, whatever, fine. Don't listen to her, engage with the material yourself. And I think, people need to become critical thinkers again. Because you could argue, and some people have, that the education system has worked to dumb us down, for decades and decades, and really eliminate critical thought as a requisite for graduating from grade school or even college in some instances, right? And so people need to become critical thinkers again and use their heads and learn how to form their own opinions. And I think, last time we talked, or the first time we talked, Peter, we talked a lot about AI and the idea of getting people so dependent on algorithm. And now it's happening where people are becoming dependent on AI summaries and aren't even reading articles like ours anymore because they're too long or whatever. I understand everyone's busy. That's fine. But what if the AI gives you a summary that isn't accurate and you're just going to go with that and be like, this is what it says, and it actually doesn't, we need to be more proactive and kind of resist this effort to keep us from losing, important mental faculties by using them, because if you don't use them, you lose them. In this particular group, I mean, there's a reason why, a lot of the same people we talked about here more broadly in the big tech sphere and intelligence are also so involved in the AI industry. To get us dependent on AI is a major goal of that. It's very explicit in the book written by Eric Schmidt and Henry Kissinger about AI in Our Human Future, it's called. But it's I don't think it's a good way to go. I mean, people need to be proactive and take responsibility, not just for, their lives and what they're doing and their finances, whatever, but also with the information they consume. So, anyone that wants to write this off as conspiracy or loose associations, I would consider you to engage with our source material, which we provide extensively. And that's true, not just of this piece, but also all of my work, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Right. I have just asked, hold on, I'm going to do a little test now, just while you're here. I've asked ChatGPT to summarize your article. I'm not going to read it all because it's quite a lot. It says the key points are InQtel and Silicon Valley, venture capital's influence, data as a commodity, Endeavor's role, public-private sector coup, historical context and key players, Bitcoin and digital currency, regulatory environment. But its conclusion is, in essence, this article paints a picture of a complex web of influence, control, and economic power wielded by elite networks through strategic investments in technology and data, underpinned by long-standing relationships with intelligence agencies and organized crime. I felt like that's okay.
Yeah, that's good. But my point is,
that's not bad, honestly. Yeah.
Well, a lot of ways these products work so that they're very good, at least at the beginning. And people on board and they use them, and then they, dominate the industry and become a monopoly. Right. And so what my point was, not that ChatGPT is horrible, whatever. It's that at some point, the people that dominate OpenAI or that program OpenAI could make it return to you inaccurate results. You're used to it being accurate for 3 years, and then it starts giving you inaccurate information. Are you going to know the difference? If you
just don't put Sam Altman in the article.
Yeah, well,
Larry Summers is on the board of OpenAI, so I don't know. We're already in trouble.
I think he's on the board of everything.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Well, look, we're 2.5 hours in. I'm sure we could go for another 2.5 hours, and we are going to do this in person at some point.
Yes.
Is there anything we've not covered that you think is essential? We have in this
there is.
right now.
There is. There's an entire part 2 of research that basically points at this web of people that are, okay, so we've basically established the proto Bitcoin dollar architects being on this advisory board, and then the custodial situation, onboarding all of this Bitcoin back into the United States. But what's kind of missing in this is the regulatory environment and manufacturing consent for the regulatory environment of capital requirements within the United States. And so when you look at, well, who's the main lobbying groups behind, the cryptocurrency industry, and you start to look at a coin center, I'm not going to say who's on there. You can go do it yourself. Who's on there? Why is the don't say it yet, Peter. Don't spoil it. We'll let them look at it. But
I'm just having a little look.
Yeah. Like, who's on the Coin Center board? There's a couple of people we mentioned in this piece, interestingly enough. And then you look at, if capital requirements and Bitcoin, but isn't it funny, Peter? Isn't that fun? If the capital, yep. See, yep.
But I can come back with an honest explanation of that based on my honest explanation earlier.
Sure.
I just can.
Sure.
I'm not saying it is, but
no doubt. Anyways, it'll be fun. I hope the readers at home are Googling or DuckDuckGoing or whatever. But so how do you create this lobby and this regulatory environment for, basically this capital requirement Bitcoin dollar system to tether it, to yoke it together? Who's running the lobbies? There's kind of 2 main lobbies in the United States, Coin Center and maybe this Digital Chamber of Commerce group. And there's a bunch of connections there. And then, you look at, what would the alternatives be to a U.S. Treasury-backed system? That's something I talk about a bunch. It's not that I'm anti-digital dollars. I'm anti-digital dollars that perpetuate the Ponzi system, that perpetuates the function of paying the service of the U.S. government's budget. So there are many ways you can build dollar instruments that don't touch Treasury Ponzi rails at all. And so, you look at some of these algorithmic alternatives. Well, we had a really famous one of those blow up quite infamously. Who was behind some of the maybe some of the blowing up there? We'll get into that. Who kind of built the infrastructure for the Ethereum merge, who built the infrastructure for the PayYUSD oncoming, kind of PayPal stablecoin. You begin to look at these webs and they're all there. So maybe the people that are manufacturing consent for the lobby, for the regulation, are all of the same people in the private and the public sector. Who wrote the stablecoin bill? Who are their sponsors? Are they connected perhaps to Nexium? Who knows? I don't know. We'll find out in the next piece together.
We'll find out in part 2.
Part 2, yes.
When's that coming?
All the research is done. Initially, it was just going to be one piece, and then we're like, all right, we're about to hit 20,000 words. It's already a book. Let's just get this out. Yeah, we know. Yeah, it will be a book at some point for sure. That's kind of what we're working on. But we're going to get part 2 out really quick. I don't know.
Well, I just want to underscore the part about what we talked about earlier with king making the corporate landscape, that early example, the mid 20th century, how endeavors like that. Okay, so you make the main players in the space, and then you have those same people that sponsor that. Those people in the private sector also sponsor politicians or other actors in the public sector that make the regulations. And who do you think they're going to design the regulations to favor? Because regulations also king make, don't they? Mm-hmm. There's winners and losers every time regulation is implemented. So obviously, if it's a lot of the same network and players involved in crafting the regulations, they're going to favor, the big players that they're tied to through various ways in the private sector. Mm-hmm. Right. And so this is, again, a way to ensure that the king of the castle stays the king of the castle. And if you're familiar with my work, I argue that the king of the castle is the merger of organized crime and intelligence that has essentially run the U.S. government and a lot more than that. Talk a lot about Britain, too, in my book. Since the 40s, the 50s, somewhere in there. And if you are organized crime, just think of organized crime as like an entity, not even as without the connotations, the negative connotations it has. The purpose of organized crime is to run rackets and to expand and perpetuate those rackets and ensure that nothing interferes with the racket. right? And a lot of the stuff we're touching up on and criticizing are, these groups have taken control of rackets. And that's why, the CIA is involved in all sorts of things like drug running and trafficking and all of this stuff. And so many of these people that have been outed over the years as sex traffickers also turn out to be intelligence assets and all of that stuff. These are not the people we want having complete surveillable control and using AI to know, a lot of the stuff with AI too, and like financial transactions, the reason they want so much of it, again, is to minimize risk, because markets like totalitarian governments, and they want to push us into a pre-crime system. So much of that has been happening. A lot of my work focuses on that. And pre-crime was legalized by Trump's Attorney General Bill Barr several years ago. When he was in office. So the legal infrastructure for that is there. And it is very bad for, stable coins like Tether to interact with the FBI and the Secret Service, which are also part of the World Economic Forum's partnership against cybercrime that's working with banks like Bank of America to surveil people and end privacy, financial privacy and online privacy. They want you to link everything you do and everything you read and every transaction you do online to a government issued ID, presumably a digital ID. They're all pushing for this. And so, we need to keep in mind these connections, especially if, we're in the space to fight for freedom, specifically financial freedom. These things do not promote that. And the FBI does not go after organized crime. They've been co-opted by organized crime. As I note in my book, J. Edgar Hoover was compromised by the mob a long time ago. Very long time ago, and the FBI has just done cover up after cover up. They manufacture the terror plots. They foil. There's so many examples of this. These are not the people that we want running our finances and running our world. Yeah, and so I think it's very important for people to be aware of these connections. Maybe it's blackpilling, but I mean, if we just sit back and let them do all of this, then what happens? And there are plenty of things we can do. And the reason I've spent, a decent amount of time talking to people in the Bitcoin space is because Bitcoin is essential to the plans of a lot of these people, but there is still time to build tools on Bitcoin or that, utilize Bitcoin to neuter a lot of the plans that they have. And sitting back and just being like, well, as long as if Wall Street takes over, we're all going to get rich. That is not the right mentality to have, in my opinion, and sort of goes against, what so many people, especially early adopters in the space, have been fighting for so long. Do you just want to sit back and let all of that just, go to ash? I think that's a poor choice personally.
You said exactly the same thing in our first interview. This is a lot for a naive little Brit to take. Oh my God, this is amazing. Poor Danny not being in this one.
I know. I love Danny so much. He's the man. So
I love Danny.
Yeah, great guy.
I love Danny. Okay, there will be a time we'll do this in person. Whitney, we've done it, Mark. So
it's only fair.
There'll be a time I'm going to come and visit. But okay, it's 8:30. I'm going on holiday tomorrow and haven't packed, haven't done shit. So I'm going to have to go and get some stuff done. This is incredible. Anyone listening, go check the article out. It's in the show notes. It's incredible. Go and check out Whitney's work. Go and check out Mark's work. Go and check out our previous interviews. And then fuck knows what you're going to do with it. But just enjoy. You two are the best. Love you all. See you later.
Thanks, Peter.
Thanks, Peter.